much in just a few pages, so it's something that you might consider reading sometime. So Wink says that Christians have often felt that there's only two ways to respond to injustice and conflict, either to fight or to flight. And these come very naturally to us, right? When we're in a crisis, when we're faced with danger and emergency, we have that inborn response, just like when we confront a tiger in the jungle, right? You either run or fight, I guess, but you have a lot of energy to deal with the issue, and those seem to be the two ways that we have tend to do that. But he is saying that Jesus teaches us a third way to deal with it, and that is through active, transformative nonviolence. So we're going to talk about this a little bit together. So the first way is flight. In the face of injustice and oppression, even violent conflict, the flight response is to be passive. We already kind of talked about this. So to be passive, to submit, to withdraw, to surrender, just to make it through, right? Some of this may be due to how we have interpreted some passages of Scripture in the past as Christians. So some people have interpreted when Jesus said, resist not evil, to think that he's counseling just submission. Or when Jesus says to turn the other cheek, they've taken that to mean, well, just let yourself be abused rather than something else. Or to go the second mile, it's been interpreted to just be nice and go along and do whatever they tell you to do. Or Romans 13:1, where it says be subject to the governing authorities. Again, it's been easy to interpret that as just like submitting to them, that's what we're supposed to do. But there's other reasons as well that people, are taking this flight way, and that is simply trying to survive in countries where there's a lot of violence and oppression, where people feel powerless and feel like they really have no other option but to simply give in or get out of the way or to avoid. And that's pretty understandable. The second way is to fight. And this is another way to respond to the oppression and the violence. At times, this is what Christians have done. Violent conflict. It might be a response of revenge or retaliation for harm done, or perhaps in a response to honor that's been offended. But when people are oppressed, sometimes people have just had enough, right? They've had enough, and so there's violent rebellion and armed rebellion. And we, last night when I was speaking about Jesus during his day, he lived in a very oppressive, militarily dominated society, and you heard us talk about how people were just so restless that their only option they could think of at that point sometimes was violent revolution. So there's also biblical theological reasons that people give for doing this. One is in the Old Testament. It seems like the Old Testament has a lot of stories about holy wars and revenge and using violence. There's also what we call the just war theory or justification, to say that this war is just war, and therefore that it rationalizes using violence. So to use the just war theory, we're saying that the gravity, the seriousness of the injustice being done and the violence toward vulnerable people merits or says it's okay to use violence to protect. And it's the idea that you can't just simply stand by when someone comes and is going to do violence to one's family. So violence and fighting often seem like a justifiable response if it's protecting other people. Now, in theorizing about just war, there's a lot of other criteria, like there's not a lot of civilians being hurt, and that the amount of violence is appropriate to the situation. But basically, it's saying that at times it is merited because of the situation. So in Jesus' day, As I said, he was under the oppression of Roman occupation, and some people were very passive. The Essenes, remember, they just went out to the desert and lived away from anybody. Most people just kind of were accommodated. Some chose violent rebellion. Jesus didn't choose either one of those two things in his teachings. Instead, we could say Jesus offered a third way of transformative, nonviolent action. So we are going to look at his teachings in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 41, which is resisting with transformative initiatives. So let me just read that passage and then offer some thoughts about interpretation that we now understand from this biblical scholar. So chapter 5 of Matthew, chapter 5, starting with verse 38 to 41. Says, "You have heard that it was said," wait a minute. Yeah. "You have heard that it is said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard, and it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For God makes sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends the rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous." So what do we do with this passage? So we are Christians. We follow Jesus. We're supposed to pay attention to his teaching. What do we do with this kind of a passage? Well, let's look at it more closely. So sometimes this do not resist evil has been understood to just, be passive. But in fact, if we look at it, it's better translated, do not resist violence. Do not resist with violence the one who is evil. So it's not that we don't resist evil. We resist evil, but not with violence, is what he's saying here. So this verse is telling us an injustice can be resisted, but it's encouraging us to think about how to do that without violence. And you can go into the Greek. He goes into the Greek to explain that the meaning of do not resist violence means do not resist with violence the one who is evil. He then gives 3 examples of what to do. What do you do then? How do you resist without violence someone who's doing wrong and doing evil? The first one is, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Now, these are not rules. These are examples of what to do, of transforming initiatives. So let me explain some of the cultural factors involved. In this culture, one doesn't use a left hand except for unclean matters. So if there was going to be somebody hit, it's going to be with the right hand that someone is hit. So to hit, says if someone strikes you on the right cheek, to hit with the right hand someone else's right cheek means that it's a back slap. Okay? Right. And that is an insult in that culture, and it's an insult in a lot of cultures. It's demeaning. It was used by superiors on inferiors to humiliate and to put them in their place and to keep them in submission. So if someone strikes you in this demeaning and insulting way, then what's he say to do? Turn the other cheek. So if a person is just struck on the right cheek and insulted and then puts his head down and walks away, they've been properly insulted and put back in their place, right? But if they turn the other cheek, left cheek, he has to use his right hand to hit him, he no longer can backslap, right, which is dishonoring. He needs to use fist to hit. And in that culture, that kind of fighting was the fighting that equals do with each other. So what's happening here is that the person who has been hit and insulted turns the other cheek, and it's like saying, that was meant for an inferior, but here, hit me again, in the way that indicates that actually I have equality with you. It's not, in a sense, doing anything disobedient, it's just doing one more action that refuses to accept the putting down and the insult. Basically what it's doing is it's refusing to be humiliated, it's taking power away from the oppressor, it's asserting oneself as an equal human being, and it's an act of defiance. It's making that person look at you or the person in a different kind of way and takes them kind of by surprise because it's asserting one's equal humanity. Okay, next example. If anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. So let's cultural factors again to interpret. Only the poorest people would have only a coat to use as collateral for a loan. And Jewish law required it in Deuteronomy 24 that it be returned at sundown so that a person would have warmth during the night. But when they got too in debt, and this was a very big problem in their day that day, when they get too in debt to pay off loans, they will be sued for everything, even that last item of a cloak. And indebtedness was a very serious problem in first century Palestine. Rome taxed the wealthy. The wealthy charged exorbitant rates on loans so they could take the land of the poor, and then they kept on taking things, even suing down to a coat. But another aspect of the culture is that nakedness was taboo. You weren't supposed to see one naked, but unlike, at least in American culture, the shame was on the one who views or causes the nakedness, rather than on the one who is naked. I don't know what Jin culture is, but in this country it would be the naked one which would be shamed. But in this culture it was like the one who caused someone to be naked or views this naked person is shamed by that. So the effect is that so they're in court, they're being sued, you have an undergarment and you have a cloak, and when they're being sued, the person decides to, okay, you want this, you can have this as well. And there that person is without anything on, naked. He's given his last little thing, last garment to the creditor. And what this does is it again is empowering. The oppressed person is taking initiative and doing something kind of surprising, right? It puts the creditor, the one who's suing to take that last item, into a difficult position, kind of an awkward position. There they are in court, and this person is now naked. And it's unmasking. It's showing to everybody this unjust system that takes every last thing from this poor person. And if he walks out there, walking naked in the streets, people notice. And it's basically showing the effects of an unjust law, that this person can legally sue down to the last cloak that they have. And it's really a call to look at things different, to repent, to change. And it empowers, again, the oppressed to take initiative and unmask a cruel, unjust system. Okay, that's maybe a little hard to understand, but that was the second one. So the third one, again, it's an example. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Okay, Roman law restricted soldiers to making people carry their backpacks, and those are about 65 to 85 pounds, for not more than 1 mile, because they didn't want to push people too far, to be too oppressive, to incite rebellion. So soldiers could make someone carry their very heavy backpack for a mile, but then they'd have to, make someone else do it for another mile. And this was a way of kind of oppressing, but not pushing too far. So they had some rules, and there were penalties if soldiers went beyond that and forced the population to do more than that. Severe military penalties. Okay, so let's think how this would be again. If you were pressed into service and were forced against your will, because the guy has the sword or whatever, to carry this very heavy backpack for 85 pounds for a mile, and you get to the end and you're very happy to get to the end, and then you give it back to the soldier, you just have been oppressed and humiliated, right? That's done exactly what they wanted, you to be put back in your place. But if when you get to the second mile mark, and what you do is not give the backpack back, you've got that backpack on, and you keep walking into the second mile. Okay, now it looks like the soldier is making you do the second mile. There's severe penalties for that. And you're walking off with his backpack, and it puts, the soldier doesn't expect this, right? It puts the soldier in a very awkward kind of position, because all of a sudden, the one he was putting down and humiliating and forcing to do labor takes the initiative, does something very surprising, kind of changes the balance of power. He's off in front walking with a backpack, and now the soldier's running after him, trying to get his backpack back, which is kind of amusing. I'm sure the people of the day when Jesus said this laughed, because it was kind of an amusing picture in their mind. And they're put in an awkward position and kind of not sure what to do. And that humiliation that was intended is kind of destroyed. It's not, it's kind of humorous to onlookers. So these are 3 examples of transformative nonviolence. And here are the principles that are involved. It's to seize the moral initiative, to do something different. It's to find a creative alternative to violence. So it takes a lot of creativity. It's, as you can see, this is very cultural specific. Within each culture, you need to kind of figure out what's going to work out. And so these are not necessarily rules, as they're examples of transformative initiatives. A creative alternative to violence. It involves inserting one's own humanity and dignity. So it's refusing to be humiliated in some ways. It's taking an initiative. It sometimes involves humor, maybe a little bit of ridicule, and it breaks that cycle of humiliation. It refuses to accept that inferior position, not in a way that it's going to probably get a person in trouble, but in a way that asserts one's humanity again. It exposes the injustice of the system. It shames the oppressor, maybe hopefully into repentance, takes control of the power dynamic, and involves standing your ground. It involves recognizing your own power to do something different, and it forces powers to make decisions that they weren't prepared to make. But then it also, because it is nonviolent, it is willing to suffer rather than to be violent toward that person. But in the process, it's causing the oppressor to see you or to see the person in a new kind of light. And then finally, it deprives the oppressor of a situation where a show of force is going to be effective. Many of these, they're complying with what's asked of them, but they're just doing something more, that kind of shows the injustice or takes the power dynamic or throws the person off balance. It agrees with the rule of law, so it's willing to undergo penalty for breaking unjust laws. But it really is dying to fear of the old order and its rules. It's living in a different kind of way that creatively looks at what's happening and thinks of ways to respond that are different, that assert one's equal humanity, that but refuse to be violent in response. Okay, so it's quite interesting once you know the cultural aspects of that to realize that is kind of what Jesus was teaching in this passage, was transforming initiatives in response to an oppressive situation that were nonviolent but still, had potential to make a difference in the situation rather than just comply and be humiliated or violent and respond that way. So let me go on to talk a little bit about some other things that Jesus taught in this passage that are the spiritual foundations for nonviolent action. And then there will be time to discuss at the end here. Yeah.
The cultural ingredients that make Jesus say all those words could really be applicable to the situation right now in Burma. It was 2,000 years ago. And now, let's say, just take as an example, going the extra mile. The situation in Burma right now is, not to mention going the extra mile, those who are willingly going to several miles have been killed. So how do you apply that going the extra mile concept to that situation? Because, even not even a mile, several miles they have been forced to go.
Yeah.
But they go willingly in the sense that, they have no other ways, they have no option, they have no choice but to follow the order. So is that really practical, or is there other way to interpret this saying in a way that would be applicable to the situation in Burma? For example, let's say in Burma, the situation, as we know, has been this way for a long time, for almost 100 years now. And people have sought to make better the situation in Burma by protesting and by several other ways other than by fighting against the military with arms. But now they have come to realize that with those ways there would be no reconciliation, no peace, no whatever. So it's not that they want to kill the military, the soldiers, but there is no other way. So what do? We are believers.
That's right.
We are followers of Christ. So what do? Do we really see this as practical, applicable, given the situation in Burma, given the ethnic people being killed no matter what? So do we have the right to defend ourselves, justifying the cause as Christian believers following Jesus? That's that, as you're projecting all the things that kind of went through my mind. So that if there is the question that if you think you can respond to, then I'll take up there.
Well, Very good. And you're thinking and asking questions, how in the world does this apply? And that's exactly what we need to be doing. I think right now what I'm doing is trying to help us understand what Jesus said in that context. Now, that, as I mentioned, it was a pretty oppressive context there too. We know that Jesus was crucified, but he wasn't the only one. That was a terrorism technique of the Roman Empire, and they killed thousands of people by crucifixion who dared to stand up against them. So that part isn't exactly the same, but the presence of military oppression and violence toward an oppressed group is in some ways similar. So the initiative, I'm not going to, first of all, I don't know how much contact people have with the military other than shooting each other. So this does involve some contact with the enemy that isn't just guns pointing at each other, So I don't know if there are those opportunities. I know there's a passage in Romans 12 that we could talk about later too, where Paul says, if you see your enemy, feed them rather than taking vengeance. Do not take vengeance, but feed your enemies. So overcome evil with good. And we can look at that a little bit more, but we actually have in our teaching about conflict transformation, we've had students in our DMIN program that have tried, and it was before this time, because right now I think the war is really more intense than it was maybe several years ago. So I don't know, exactly the answer to your question, but there were some that took some surprising initiatives of reaching out to the enemy in their area and being more hospitable and feeding rather than acting in a different kind of way. In fact, along that line, I'll just go ahead and say this. The story that I was going to mention at the end is such an interesting one of Elisha. I don't know if I have it still. It's the king of Aram, and I'll tell you what the passage is later. I can't remember right offhand. The king of Aram is out to get Elisha in the Old Testament narrative. And the reason he is because Elisha kind of can foresee what where the king is, and whenever he wants to attack the king of Israel, he'll tell the king of Israel so they can't get attacked, and he's really upset. He's going to go come and get Elijah, and you probably remember this story. They surround the whole city where Elisha was, and the servant goes out and is like freaked out, and then Elisha says, open his eyes, and they see that, there are God's horses and all are kind of a vision of God's protection. Well, Elijah prays in this incident and prays that these soldiers will be blind, thousands of these soldiers, and they're blinded, they're unable to see. So this is a perfect opportunity to kill off this whole group who've been problematic, the enemies. So they come and they're looking for Elijah, and Elijah says, well, here, let me bring you to him, and makes them travel 18 kilometers blind into Samaria, the capital city of Israel. And the king of Israel says, well, should I kill them all? And Elisha says, no, feed them. And so the king of Israel makes a big feast, and they regain their sight, and here they are in the presence of the enemy, and they're serving them a big banquet, and they have lots of food together, and then they go home, and it says, and they didn't raid into Israel after that. So this is kind of an Old Testament example of feeding the enemy that then seems to be Paul picks up. That's a transformative initiative too. We don't normally, if someone is our enemy, we're not hospitable toward them. So that's another example. But I don't know, this is what you will need to figure out as pastoral and religious leaders. How do you think creatively about that situation and respond to oppression and enmity and violence in a way that matches these words, not like as a rule, but as an example of throwing people off guard so that they look at you in a different way, so that they are shamed, maybe, a little bit, and brought to a place where the relationship is a little bit different. So it's not passive, it's not just accepting it, it's not violent, it's doing something creatively different that's trying to build the relationship in a different way. That's all I'm going to say right now. Let me go on to the rest of this, and then y'all can talk about that, because you're probably the ones who, you know that situation in Burma about what would be the possibilities to do everything, or is everybody just lined up with guns and just shooting at this point?
I'm just talking about taking control of power dynamics in terms of dealing with this oppressor. We have been doing this, but we try to find some alternative, be creative enough to be able to engage in a different level, maybe emotionally, or but what we are right now is we need. I think in your lecture you mentioned about the ground truth, where we can begin dialogue and engage from there.
Yeah. Thank you for those comments.
You just mentioned about the taking control of the power
Taking
dynamics. I
dynamic.
think that's what Jesus was trying to do.
Yes, it was
in this
actually.
scenario.
Yeah. In a way that helped the oppressor see things in a different way, retain the dignity of the person, and hopefully maybe a different kind of relationship. Yeah. Well, let me go on here, and I think you are the creative group that kind of figure out what does this mean Burma style? You know what I mean? I'm not sure I can tell you exactly, but I think all of you dealing with these things that Jesus said, what does this mean? This is exactly the role of pastors, is trying to apply the scriptures, take them seriously, and figure out what does this mean in our current situation. But let's look a little bit more. So Jesus does talk about love of enemies. This is actually one of the really unique things about Jesus' teaching. And I think it's where he actually really critiques and opposes some of what's taught in the Old Testament. Because there's a lot of holy wars back there. And he's saying love of enemies instead. So that's at the heart of his third way. Loving enemies recognizes that the enemy is also a child of God. Maybe not as a Christian, but as a creation of God. And has some part of the image of God within them that makes it possible for transformation. It refuses to demonize the enemy or to see them as beyond redemption, and rather seeks to understand their perspective, to understand the threat that justice holds for them. So even for the military, there's probably some fear that if they give in and lose, they'll all be destroyed. I would imagine that they wonder what'll happen. They'll lose everything. So there's some, to try to understand what it is on their side that keeps them going like that. This is really difficult, really difficult. Of course it is, because there's been so much suffering involved. But so it requires great faith, and it throws us on God's grace. And in fact, the experience of loving and forgiving enemies is probably possible only through God's enabling of us to do that. But we must love and see the good in our enemies in order. We need to see the good in the enemy as the basis of demanding justice or loving them, because you have to kind of believe that there's possible to have change. That conversion, not extermination, is the goal when Jesus says to love our enemy. And to change, really the enemy must receive the assurance that they're not going to lose everything if they would agree to not be violent. There needs to be a place even for the enemy in the new order that we're working for, that they don't think they'll just be killed off and have nothing. So rather than humiliate, their honor, in some sense, needs to be guarded, and the end goal of building a just new society needs to always be kept in mind. So the goal is not just to defeat, it's to also seek the enemy's good by liberating them from their own oppressive actions. Their oppressive actions are deforming them spiritually. And so the effort to also provide release for them to be better people. Enemies need to be seen not only as they are now, but also as they could be if they were transformed by God's power. This is hard to do, isn't it? This is what loving enemies, and we hear Martin Luther King Jr. talks a lot about this, is involved. Also, one of the foundations is the means that we use to bring about this new order needs to fit what the new order, what the post-war was like, the society that we want to be built. And the use of violence to gain power doesn't easily lead to the respect for persons that's needed to build a healthy and just society. So violence tends to simply change the rulers, not the rules. And so often when violence is used to turn about a society, you end up with more unjust rulers, just different ones. And it's not actually transformed the society. Also, there needs to be respect for the rule of law. So even when civil disobedience to unjust laws are necessary, the rule of law needs to be respected. We need laws. We need the rule of law. And sometimes going up against, I'm not thinking about war so much, but going up against unjust laws it needs to happen to deal with the injustice, but ends up people experiencing the penalty of that. And that's what civil disobedience, it accepts what the penalty for breaking a law is if laws are broken. Romans 13 is another passage, and basically I would understand that to mean that political order and rule of law is desired by God and needed for the common good. But it's not just talking about submitting to whatever any government tells you to do. We have lots of examples of, like Peter saying, I have to obey God rather than humans, so we have that kind of standing up. Accurately translated, it is armed resistance in Romans 13 that is, we're told not to engage in against the government. And then finally, rooting out violence within is required to respond with nonviolence. If we resist violence with violence, we simply mirror its evil, and we become what we resist. I'm thinking of this a lot in terms of the Israel-Hamas situation. So Hamas did a terrible thing in just going in and slaughtering innocent civilians. But then Israel's response has been, I think, what we're up to, 12,000 plus people and they're on the brink of starvation, according to the news today, that whole 2.3 million people. So the response in Israel has been, they have violence for violence, they've mirrored the violence, and really their violence is, I would say, much worse than what Hamas did, even though that was a terrible, terrible. They became the evil that they were trying to wipe out, in a sense. So maybe disagreement on that, but it's hard when you compare the numbers. It's really disproportionate what has happened there. It requires spiritual courage to face up to evil within, definitely. It involves recognizing there is darkness in each of us, and it involves ongoing spiritual transformation. And then the way of the cross. Jesus' way is the way of the cross. You may not think about Jesus so much this way, but I really think of Jesus as engaged in this nonviolent struggle for justice. He wanted justice for the people, and he wanted a good life for the people. But he was willing to go for it, even if it meant he would suffer. And the nonviolent struggle may and does involve suffering sometimes. I have to be honest with you, the research, and I do have something I wanted to share with you, the research related to the suffering tends to show that it's more in violent uprisings than it is in nonviolent struggles. But nevertheless, people, as you well know, are killed in nonviolent struggles as well, and Jesus would as well. The cross means we may not win because unjust power is entrenched, but what Jesus' way did is it kind of evoked, it took the violence of the system onto himself, and he refused to be violent back. And so it drew the poison onto Jesus. He died, but it was the seeds for a different kind of life lived because of his refusal. So finally, the thing that we need to live out is a way of life that is the outcome of what we desire. So what kind of society do we want afterward? And that's the means by which we need to kind of get there, if that makes sense. So do we want to discuss this now, or do you want me to go on and talk about the research? Let me do one more thing, one little thing. It won't take too long. And there is a handout, so you can read it more thoroughly. This one right here. So let me walk through it really fast. Yeah. I don't have a PowerPoint on this, but there has been a lot of research on violent and nonviolent movements, and Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan have written a book, and they actually have there's a website with a ton of resources, some of them in Burmese, and I'll try to get that website address for you. But most people assume that military power is the most effective form of power, and that the threat or use of force would be the most effective way of waging political struggle for change. But they did research for all these campaigns between 1900 and 2006. They looked at 323 violent and nonviolent resistance movements, and their research showed that actually nonviolent resistance is more effective. So I know there's violence going on right now, but there is a question of how to pull that back, because the nonviolent resistance tends to be more effective. So the research and book focused on two questions: why nonviolent resistance often succeeds compared to violent resistance, and under what conditions it succeeds. So if you look at the data there under the bullet points, nonviolent resistance campaigns were nearly twice as likely to achieve full or partial success than their violent counterparts. Successful campaigns, nonviolent, 53% of the time, violent, 25%. Partially successful, nonviolent, 25%, violent, 13%. And failures were much lower for nonviolent, 22%, versus the violent campaigns, which was 62% failure. In anti-regime resistance campaigns, liberation from foreigner occupier, nonviolent strategies greatly enhanced the likelihood of success. When seeking territorial objectives, anti-occupation or self-determination, nonviolence had a slight advantage. Violent insurgency led to more success. When there's succession, then sometimes violence was more successful. So the authors wondered, why was the ones who did this research went in there thinking violence would be more effective. So she was kind of surprised at the whole situation. But why would it be more effective? And it says nonviolent campaigns allow more people to participate. Fewer people, are willing to take up guns and fight in a violent kind of campaign. So you can get a larger number of people involved. Oh, thank you. Forgot I had this one. And that's the research. Thank you for up there on it. Okay, and that's the probability. I forgot I put that on. There's higher participation. It's more broad-based, so it's resilient. There's more tactical and strategical innovation. It expands civil disruption to the status quo of the regime. There can be loyalty shifts, and local supporters are more reliable than external supporters. Violent campaigns are often successful if there's an external power, another country that's supporting the violent regime, and sometimes they don't support anymore, and all of a sudden that fails. So here is the graph of the kind of purple is the nonviolent success or failures, and the red is the violent. So I say this, I mean, I know that Burma has tried very hard nonviolence, and actually with the coup, the most recent coup, it was kind of doing nonviolence in a wonderful way. And I know there was a lot of violence related to that. And nonviolence doesn't always work. I agree, it shows it here. But I present this to you just because it shows that it has more of a chance usually. It may not be, in your situation, but it has more of a chance usually. And here's the probability that a country will be a democracy 5 years after a campaign ends. And you can see if it's been a nonviolent campaign, it's much more likely to be, have a flourishing country or democracy than if it's been violent. Or if it's even been a failed campaign, if it's used nonviolent tactics, it's more likely to be democratic, go by the rule of law, if they use nonviolence. So I want you to know that's what the research shows, which kind of backs up Jesus' teaching. I know that you're in the middle of a situation that is, is violence. So it's a lot of thinking about what to do, how to get to a place that's manageable. But this is information that I think is just helpful for you to think about as you try to figure out how to manage that. So those are kind of, there's a lot of questions potentially or things to discuss. I could talk about some other tools and stuff, but why don't I stop there and you can lead the discussion, okay?
Okay. Siya chun discussion ka ama yi chimmi Congress se bachun atunaya kan president ni kan ram sininge kan achom piak mi kha van la kho salamo ti mi Congress se van chim twari ni puselo le ama ni chun he ka hin argument katela chu atwa mi chu zeti sipa ma hi research kan zau tik zonga hin non violence work kau ram tampia hin naw min ti mi kha asitika mai hi meta jong hin manding se ko lo mo ti mi hi chu ma amani hin avan chwa bi mi kha se chutika kan ma borua ka kan van tua kho mi jong kan van zu kho mi lo lai tu lewa chun ka bak ding ti jong kha lai sema se lo kan zau tika kan atu long kha zau lo in mai le ya te zai tukin da ti mi kha kha ma chun maka ram le mi phun kong long kan chimi ruwa van ruwa usit ti kan du church context ate ti mi kha van ruwa ter ka du ngai Jadi biar krifa buat pakai pakat itin ihuntir mo pakat reaction kan tua mi mo cuba untuk kate hi belo hi non violence jadi nak krifa bu cunga te kan man kola timi zong hi van irwa tahu selo macam roh ini hau si timi ka van cipta kedu ka hau dah microphone tu lai okay president